Don't Take Anything from the Graveyard, a chilling story of a family haunted by a mysterious boy and unexplainable forces. What happens when the dead refuse to stay buried? Watch if you dare. I was living a completely ordinary life until a sudden tragedy hit our family. My wife's father, my father-in-law, unexpectedly passed away. I can't say a bad word about him, on the contrary, he was a truly remarkable man, always ready to help anyone, even to the point of giving his last shirt if the situation required it. My wife, Emily, loved him dearly and was constantly in touch with him. Naturally, after his death, she began to look like a living corpse. She lost her appetite, slept almost all the time, and answered every question in monosyllables. She even had to quit her job. I had hoped that her employer would understand her situation and allow her to take unpaid leave, but no, they didn't need employees like her. It was painful to watch my wife suffer, but I didn't know how to help her. Through a friend, I managed to get prescription medications. As she took them, Emily's health slowly improved. However, there were some things that medication alone couldn't fix. Every week, she insisted that I take her to her father's grave. Normally, it was just the two of us going, leaving our daughter, Chloe, with my mother. But this time, everything went differently. Friday was approaching, and, as usual, Emily asked me to drive her to her father's grave. I didn't refuse and immediately started calling my mother. "Hi, Mom. How are you?" Instead of the usual greeting, a tense voice answered. "What happened?" I explained the situation, offering help if possible. "I understand, maybe I can bring some medicine if needed." After that, the conversation changed direction. I then informed Emily of the news. Since there was nowhere to leave Chloe, we decided that we would all go together tomorrow. Saturday morning came, and Emily hadn't slept since early dawn. She moved around the house in a daze, preparing breakfast for Chloe and me but barely touching anything herself. The sight of her so fragile and lost was heartbreaking. I wanted to help her, but I felt helpless. How do you console someone who seems to have lost their will to live? After breakfast, we set off for the cemetery. Emily insisted that Chloe stay with me in the car, though I could tell that our daughter, curious and perceptive as ever, was uneasy about the visit. The drive was silent, except for Emily's occasional muttered phrases and Chloe's questions about why people go to cemeteries. "Dad, why does Mom always need to go there?" Chloe asked, fidgeting in her seat. "Well, honey, sometimes people feel closer to someone they've lost when they visit their grave," I explained cautiously, glancing at Emily. Emily approached her father's grave slowly, her steps heavy, almost reluctant. She spoke to him as if he were still there, recounting her day, her worries, and even small mundane things like what she had eaten or what she saw on TV. I watched her with growing unease. Her voice trembled, her lips quivering, and her hands occasionally shook as though she were holding back a torrent of emotions. Chloe looked confused. She hadn't expected her mother to act like this. "Do you have your phone with you?" I asked gently, trying to keep the mood normal for her. "Go play for a while," I added, knowing she needed some distraction. Chloe wandered off toward a nearby fence, still glancing nervously at her mother. Emily's grief seemed to grow with every step she took closer to the grave. Tears poured freely down her cheeks, and fragments of words came out in a trembling voice. It was almost ritualistic, the way she spoke to her father, yet chilling in its intensity. I felt like a bystander in a story I couldn't control. The cemetery was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of fresh earth and wilted flowers. The wind rustled through the trees, and I could swear I heard whispers among the tombstones, though I dismissed them as imagination. After what felt like hours, we returned to the car. Emily was pale and trembling, clutching her jacket around herself. Chloe climbed in, silent, eyes wide as though she had witnessed something she wasn't sure she understood. On the drive home, Emily barely spoke. Once home, I tried to maintain a calm atmosphere. I suggested that maybe the cemetery visits should be reduced, at least until she felt a little stronger. "I know," she whispered. "But it's like. I don't know. If I don't go, I feel him leaving me all over again." That night, I lay awake, thinking. The sight of Emily crying by the grave would haunt me for a long time. I realized that something about these visits seemed to make her worse instead of better. But how could I forbid her from going? And yet, watching her like this was unbearable. As I drifted to sleep, I considered solutions. Maybe professional help was the only way. Perhaps Emily's grief had taken a turn into something more than just mourning. I resolved to seek a private psychiatrist, no matter the cost. I had to find a way to help her regain control over her mind before it became something far more dangerous. The next morning, Emily woke up looking exhausted, her hair disheveled and her face drawn. She whispered, "I don't even know if I really slept." Her words chilled me. I knew this was more than grief, there was a deeper unrest brewing inside her. I encouraged her to see a doctor, and after some initial resistance, she agreed. Meanwhile, Chloe's presence added another layer of tension. She was confused, innocent, and yet perceptive enough to notice the unease in the house. I had to act carefully, making sure she felt safe while I dealt with the growing concern about Emily. Even small things around the house started to feel eerie. Sounds that once would have gone unnoticed, the creak of a floorboard, the rustle of curtains, now seemed amplified in the quiet of our home. Every time Chloe spoke to her mother, I could see Emily's mood swinging unpredictably. By the end of the day, I realized that the cemetery visits, the unresolved grief, and the isolation were forming a perfect storm. Something had to change, and soon, before it spiraled out of control. In the following days, life at home became increasingly tense. Emily's mood fluctuated wildly. One moment she was quiet and withdrawn, the next she would startle at minor noises or murmur to herself as though talking to someone unseen. Chloe, only 8 years old, grew wary, watching her mother with wide eyes. It was as if the house itself had become charged with an invisible presence. One evening, I was settled on the couch, ready to unwind after a long day. I had a beer in one hand and the TV remote in the other. Chloe was in her room, and Emily had decided to rest. For a few minutes, the apartment was calm, too calm. Then, I started hearing faint noises. At first, it was just a whisper, almost imperceptible, like someone speaking softly through a closed door. I ignored it, thinking it was Chloe on the phone. But the sound persisted. I muted the TV and listened carefully. It was Emily's voice, or at least a voice that sounded exactly like hers, coming from Chloe's room. Confused, I got up and quietly went to check. "Chloe?" I called gently, not wanting to startle her. There was no answer. The room was empty. Her laptop was off, the phone charging, and there was no one hiding anywhere obvious. Even the closet and under the bed were empty. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I called Chloe down. She looked at me, puzzled. "Dad, I was just talking on the phone with my friend." "That's it." Her explanation made sense logically, but it didn't calm me. I was certain I had heard Emily's voice, not Chloe's. My mind raced with possibilities: exhaustion, stress, or something else entirely. I decided to document everything. Maybe installing a camera in Chloe's room could reveal what was really happening. That night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about the sounds. Emily was asleep beside me, her face drawn and tense, murmuring occasionally in her sleep. I wondered if she was dreaming about her father, if that's why the voice sounded so real. I resolved to take a few days off work to watch the situation closely. The next morning brought no relief. I was just getting ready for work when my phone rang. It was Emily, her voice urgent but low. "Vadim, come home immediately." Her words sent a shock through me. Something terrible must have happened. I didn't wait for her to explain. I called my boss, explained the emergency, and was immediately allowed to leave. Driving home felt surreal, like time had slowed. My mind replayed every possible scenario. What if Chloe had been hurt? What if Emily was in danger? I arrived at the apartment, expecting the worst. But there was only confusion. Chloe was in the living room, unharmed, looking scared and unsure. Emily, on the other hand, was pale, tear-streaked, and trembling. Her hair was a mess, and she couldn't even form coherent words at first. What happened? I demanded, trying to stay calm despite the racing of my heart. Emily finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know. I just heard voices in Chloe's room. I felt a deep unease settle over me. Something wasn't right. The atmosphere of the house was different, heavier, oppressive. Even Chloe seemed to sense it. I reassured both of them as best I could, though inside I felt powerless. By the evening, after Emily had taken her medication and Chloe was distracted with her toys, I sat alone in the living room. I realized that professional help was now not just a suggestion, it was a necessity. Emily's grief, combined with these strange occurrences, could not be managed at home alone. I had to act quickly before things escalated further. And then, as if to punctuate my fears, I heard a soft thud from Chloe's room. A shadow moved across the wall, fleeting but unmistakable. My pulse quickened. Something, or someone, was there. The next few days felt like we were living in a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. Emily's grief, which had already been overwhelming, now seemed to attract something darker. Small things in the apartment started to feel wrong. Doors would creak open by themselves. Occasionally, I'd hear footsteps in the hallway when Chloe was safely in her room and Emily was resting. Objects subtly moved positions, a book on the table, a cup on the counter, nothing drastic, but enough to make the atmosphere heavy and uneasy. Emily refused to speak about it directly, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Chloe, for her part, was confused and scared. She had begun glancing around the apartment constantly, as if expecting something to appear at any moment. One afternoon, Emily insisted she wanted to visit her father's grave again. I tried to discourage her, suggesting that maybe taking a break would help her rest and regain stability. She shook her head firmly. I need to see him, even for a few minutes. I agreed, knowing resistance would only worsen her anxiety. We all got into the car, Emily, Chloe, and I, and drove to the cemetery. The air was thick and cold, unusual for that time of year, making the quiet graveyard even more eerie. Emily approached her father's grave slowly. She knelt, speaking softly as if he were listening, telling him about her days, her worries, and the loneliness she felt. Tears ran down her cheeks, and her body trembled with suppressed emotion. Chloe stayed a few steps back, watching her mother with wide, worried eyes. It was then that I saw him. A boy, standing near one of the other graves, staring directly at us. He appeared to be a teenager, but there was something unnatural about him. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were fixated on Chloe. My heart skipped a beat. "Who is that?" I whispered to Emily, but she didn't answer. The boy didn't move. He just stood there, silently, as if waiting. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Something about him was wrong. I could almost feel it radiating from him, a presence that didn't belong in the world of the living. Chloe, oblivious to my fear, had wandered closer to him. Her innocence, her curiosity, drew her in, and my stomach churned with panic. I called out, "Chloe, stay close to me." The boy didn't flinch. He simply nodded slowly, as if acknowledging her presence, then turned and walked away, disappearing between the tombstones. The air seemed to shift immediately, colder, heavier. I hugged Chloe tightly, making sure she felt safe, while Emily remained frozen at her father's grave, her face pale and eyes wide. That night at home, nothing felt normal. Every creak, every whisper in the apartment, seemed amplified. Emily muttered to herself, pacing between the rooms, sometimes stopping mid-step to stare at empty corners. Chloe clung to me, frightened by sounds that seemed impossible. It became clear that what we were dealing with wasn't just grief anymore. Something from the cemetery had followed us, or perhaps Emily's intense mourning had drawn it closer. The presence was subtle, almost invisible, but undeniably there. I knew then that this was more than just a psychological strain, it was something that required immediate attention, not only for Emily but for Chloe as well. And then it happened. While Emily slept fitfully that night, I heard it clearly, a voice, soft and insistent, coming from the living room. It sounded like Chloe, calling for her mother, but it wasn't her. My heart raced. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly approached the living room. Shadows moved across the walls, elongated and twisting unnaturally. I couldn't see anyone, yet the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I called out. "Who's there? Show yourself." The only response was silence, followed by a soft thud, like a toy being placed gently on the floor. Chloe's favorite stuffed animal lay at the center of the room. I picked it up, trembling. Something was very wrong. From that moment, I realized we were no longer alone. The house, the cemetery, Emily's grief, they had all become conduits for something I couldn't explain. I had to protect my family, no matter what it took. I made a decision: we would seek professional help immediately, cameras would be installed, and I would watch every move, every sound, every shadow. The next week was unbearable. Every sound in the apartment set my nerves on edge. Emily's grief had deepened into something unrecognizable, and Chloe was constantly on edge, sensing the tension even if she didn't understand it. I spent my days observing every shadow, every creak of the floorboards, and every unexplained movement. Then it happened. One night, I was stepping outside to smoke when I saw a figure standing directly across from our apartment door. My heart froze. It was the same boy from the cemetery, pale, silent, and unnervingly still. "Hey! What are you doing here?" I shouted through the darkness. The boy didn't move. Slowly, he raised his hand toward Chloe's apartment. My chest tightened with fear. I ran back inside, locked the door, and grabbed Emily and Chloe. "Stay here," I whispered urgently. "Don't go near the windows." Minutes felt like hours. Then, I heard Emily screaming from the kitchen. I rushed in and saw Chloe pointing toward the hallway. The boy was there, somehow inside the apartment. His pale face glowed faintly in the dim light, his eyes fixed on Chloe. "I'm taking her," he said in a voice that was both human and not, echoing strangely in the room. I lunged at him, but he vanished, leaving only a chill in the air. Chloe was unharmed physically, but the fear on her little face cut deeper than any injury could. Emily collapsed on the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. I held her, whispering that everything would be okay, though I didn't know if that was true. The following morning brought no relief. We tried to keep the house calm, but shadows seemed longer, sounds sharper, and the feeling of being watched was constant. Then, disaster struck. A spark from the kitchen stove ignited something. We later learned it was an old faulty wire, and flames quickly spread. Panic took over. I grabbed Chloe and Emily, dragging them outside just as smoke filled the apartment. "Call the fire department," I yelled to neighbors, my heart pounding. By the time firefighters arrived, the apartment was heavily damaged. I watched helplessly as flames consumed what we had once called home. Emily clung to Chloe, shaking, tears streaking her soot-covered face. It was in that chaos that I realized something important: the supernatural presence, the cemetery, Emily's grief, it had all escalated beyond control. The apartment, the safety we once took for granted, was gone. All that remained was the family, together, and terrified. In the following days, Emily agreed to seek professional help. Psychiatrists, cameras, and strict routines became our new normal. I stayed vigilant, watching shadows and listening for whispers, but slowly, with treatment and care, Emily began to regain some sense of reality. Chloe, though shaken, grew more confident, understanding that her father would always protect her. But even now, months later, I can feel it sometimes, that cold presence in empty rooms, the echo of footsteps when no one is there, the faint whisper in the dark. It reminds me that grief, especially unresolved grief, can open doors we never intended to unlock. We survived. But we will never forget the boy from the cemetery, the unseen presence, and the night our lives were forever changed.